Hi, everyone. It's me, Tim. Today, I want to talk about learning design from other disciplines. And by disciplines, I could mean hobbies, activities, anything you do besides video games. So, this is an answer to the question from Ezra Stanton, 8685, who asks, I'm curious, what other artistic disciplines do you think have the most to teach us about game design? And what did it teach you about game design? Examples: drawing, painting, writing, animation, dancing, making music, cooking, etc. Ooh, that's a good question. I'll talk about some of my hobbies or other things I do, and then I'll talk to you about kind of how that all comes together in my design aesthetic, my design motifs. I'm not sure what I'd call it. First of all, let's talk about reading. I do a lot of reading. I've talked about some of it already on here, and books are amazing in that they can go anywhere, describe anything. In that sense, they're beyond movies, they're beyond TV shows, and because of that, I get a lot of neat ideas, especially when I'm reading some novel story with an interesting setting or interesting mechanic, and I think, how would I do that in a video game? I talk about this in the video I have about Roger Zelazny's Lord of Light and how I would turn it into a CRPG. I'll link that below. But this happens with a lot of books I read, sci-fi, fantasy, even regular books where I'm like, or horror or non-sci-fi fantasy, where I'm like, how would I make a game with a person who could do that? Or in a setting that was like that? What other things would happen? And it really gets me going. Non-video games are the same way. I've talked about playing tabletop RPGs since I was like 14. They are brimming with novel system mechanics and unusual settings that still have not been done in video games. So they're a huge source of ideas, but they're also an interesting source of mechanics that can't be overly complex because you need a human GM and it's human players who have to manipulate these rules. So it makes you realize that you can do a lot without making really complicated mechanics and unusually convoluted settings. And I'm not just talking tabletop RPGs. This is true for card and dice games, which frequently have really interesting mechanics and that additional limitation of it's all done with cards or it's all done with dice or maybe a combination. That interesting limitation paradoxically results in a lot more fruitful ideas in that space. And sometimes I've looked at things like that, those games, and gone, oh, that would work really well in a game. Related to writing and gaming, or reading and gaming, is writing. I've talked about how I've tried to do writing myself. I've done writing in some of my games, more successful in some than others. For short form writing, I've learned, yeah, I can do that. That's things like the lore text on items, or the names of creatures, or the names of items, or even short pieces of dialogue like narration. The Fallout opening narration, I wrote that. It's pretty good, I think. It made me think I was good, and then when I went to go do Temple, I found out, no, I'm not that good. What I found out is, for most cases, I'm not very good at long form writing. I've tried writing books, I'm not good at it, but I've written manuals. I wrote a big chunk of the Arcanum manual, and it's considered pretty good. Where I really break down is when it involves characters, writing dialogues, even short dialogues that are used in cutscenes. I'm just not that good at that. So I learned by doing there. You will not always be successful, and additional learning sometimes won't make you better at the thing you're trying to do. Now let me talk about something that I love doing that has nothing to do with games, you would think. And that's cooking and baking. Now, on the surface, these seem pretty much the same, especially people who haven't done it. Aren't these the same thing? No, they could not be more different. Cooking is done very much stovetop, or whatever you're on, whatever heat source you're using. And you really have to know a lot about all the different kinds of tools you're going to use. The pans, stainless steel versus copper versus nonstick versus cast iron, all very different. And not necessarily one better than the other, but you quickly learn that they have different uses, and you can take advantage of them for different dishes. Utensils, and what utensils to use on all those pans. Cooking also seems to rely a lot less on measurement. When I'm cooking, I often throw in like the chicken breast or the steak, and I don't really know how much it weighs. I sprinkle on spices. I'm relying more on sight, sound. When I'm especially when I'm cooking stovetop, I'm listening to like, oh, that doesn't sound like it's sizzling like that anymore. It's sizzling too much. Smell, taste, that all factors into what you're cooking right there. Now, when I do cooking, I tend to vary the spices a lot, even on dishes I've made frequently. I mix things up. I'm like, I'm going to try a different broth in here. I'm going to try a different combination of spices. I have some leftovers I don't know what to do. I'm going to throw them in this thing and see what happens. What I tend to do when I cook is I hone in on a result by observing it really carefully and kind of manipulating it while I'm doing it. Baking is the complete opposite. It's in an oven. Yes, you still have to learn differences in pans, like glass pans versus metal pans. You also learn the difference between normal cooking and convection cooking. In the last few years, I've been using a convection oven, and I've learned a great deal. It's awesome if you're making something like a pizza or cookies. You don't, or you want chicken that's got crispy skin or whatever. It's not as useful for a lot of other baking things, but one thing that's always the case with baking is you have to measure very carefully. If something says use a teaspoon of something, you don't just throw stuff in. It's super, super important to measure when you bake. Watch the Great British Bake Off if you don't believe me. Also with baking, you tend to throw it in and ignore it for a while. Nothing much interesting happens at the beginning of baking. Most of the interesting stuff happens at the end. That's when you look at it, you touch it, you smell it, you put toothpicks into it and then look at the toothpick. This is where baking and cooking really differs. You don't walk away from something cooking on your stovetop. You frequently walk away for sometimes a long time from something that's going on in the oven. Now, I'm pretty good at both cooking and baking, but I think I'm a better baker than I am a cook, and I think that just comes from experience. Now, I'm going to throw a little interesting intersection here. Crock pots have been around for a while. I've been using crock pots since college. And then more recently, Instant Pots, which are really just fancy, nice pressure cookers. They're like cooking in that measurement isn't as important. I've made a lot of stuff in my Instant Pot where I just toss in a bunch of things. I don't know. Oh, I'm making 4 hard-boiled eggs. I'm making a dozen. Doesn't matter. Oh, I'm throwing in some chicken, dumping in this can of soup, sprinkling in some spice, putting the lid on, boom. 20 minutes later, chicken mush. The measurement isn't important, but it's more like baking in that. So it's like cooking in that you don't have to measure, but it's like baking in that you really don't pay attention till the end. And in fact, you can't with a Instant Pot. You don't know what's going on in there until the timer's up. For a crock pot, you shouldn't keep checking because every time you take that lid, you lose valuable heat. So with both of those, it's kind of like baking in that you throw it all together and you just like, well, let's see what happens at the end. Want to throw one side thing in here about coding, even though it wasn't on Ezra's original list. Coding is real interesting because you can learn a lot about game design if you know how to program. I've mentioned this before. I think programmers organize their game designs better. Now, does that make a better game? Maybe not, but it makes it easier to make the game when you have a very organized design. But also, programming-based designers think also about how they want their mechanics implemented and not just what they want implemented. So they don't just throw out a bunch of mechanics and go, I want this. They're also like, I want this. And also, I think if you did it this way, we could use this mechanic for poison and radiation and consumables. So what do you think, programmer? And in that sense, I've said frequently, I enjoy as a programmer working with designers who know how to code a little more than ones that don't. Not say I've worked with some great designers who don't know how to code, and I've worked with some awful designers who know how to code. But in general, if a designer knows how to code a little bit, that's a plus. So what did I learn from all these things? I've said it as I'm going along, but I'll tell you the 3 big takeaways I have from having other things that I do affect my game designs. 1, planning starts early. You want to make sure you have the things you need. You don't want a half-mixed bowl of something you're going to bake, or something that's half cooked on the skillet, and then you discover you're out of salt. Then you discover you don't have any butter, or oil or the right oil. And you're like, well, what can you do? The bowl is half mixed. Maybe the wet has already hit the dry, and now clock's ticking on when this thing has to go in the oven. Or maybe it's half cooked in the skillet, and it's like, well, you're going to have to finish cooking it. You're going to have to figure out how to substitute. Not good. What you really should do is put out all your ingredients before you ever start making whatever you're making. Another thing is you got to keep an eye on things, and at the right times. I've mentioned that when you're cooking, you got to kind of watch it all the time. But baking, you got to watch it. You can ignore it for a while, but then you have to keep an eagle eye on it at the end. Making a game is the same way. You have to pay attention to the right things at the right time as you go along. And sometimes it's not an eye. Sometimes you listen to things. Maybe it's what people were saying about the game. Maybe it's you're really far into the game and you're realizing a mechanic's not working because there's no good visual and audio trigger. You need them both. Maybe you just go by gut. I cook a lot and bake a lot just by feels. Sometimes I design by feels. This function, this design mechanic, it's in as described, but it's not feeling right. So sometimes you just have to change it. And then finally, the thing I really learned is it takes a long time to learn a new skill. You don't become a good baker overnight. You don't watch people bake on TV and then become a good baker. It takes time. It takes practice. And you're going to mess up. And that's okay. You're also going to learn what your limitations are. I'm a better baker than I'm a cook. I can write short form writing, but long form writing, especially dialogue, has eluded me. I've learned to accept that limitation. You'll have to learn the same thing. So these are the big three things that I've learned from my hobbies and other things. Planning, keeping an eye on it, and just taking the time to do it. So, Ezra, I hope that answered your question.